My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk not so much about plot points or anything like that, but more about Tolkien's very, very interesting focus on language, and in particular, poetry. Um, Tolkien is really the person who got me interested in poetry. When I was learning poetry in grade school and high school, I just couldn't really get into it. But reading Tolkien's poetry, it was so well written, and of course the narrative poetry was interesting in and of itself because of the narrative, that it really helped me kind of get more interested in poetry and really get more aware of the value of poetic writing, let's say. And of course, Tolkien himself thought that poetry was kind of like the highest form of the use of language, and partially because of that, he developed his languages in some sense in order to write really good poetry. I'm not going to get into that aspect of it as much. Sooner or later, I'll do a video on his take on the idea of inventing languages and that sort of thing. He wrote an entire essay, which was a lecture actually, but you can get it in essay form, called A Secret Vice, on his thoughts on the invention of language, but that's another video. I don't want to get into that here. For now, I just want to talk kind of generally about some of the poetry he wrote and get into some of the more interesting aspects of it and how different some of his different poetry was. So let's get started. So of course, if you've read pretty much any of Tolkien's fictional work, you've read some of his poetry. He's got poetry scattered throughout pretty much everything he ever wrote. I mean, even going back to the his early workings on the Story of Kullervo, which I've done a video on, contains some small amounts of poetry. The Hobbit, of course, Bilbo writes some poetry. And then Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of different poems thrown in, some of them by Bilbo, some by, some are ancient poems by elves. I mean, there's tons of them. But he's got also several books out that are basically focused on poetry. Some of those being more recent releases that are it's Christopher Tolkien mostly releasing things that he wrote and never finished. Some of those examples are The Fall of Arthur, which I highly recommend, by the way. It unfortunately ends before it really starts to get interesting in the story, but the poetry is really well done. I'll come back to this because it's a good example of a particular type of poetry that he really enjoyed writing. There is, of course, also his translation of Beowulf, which, if you're into Old English literature, is basically a must. I mean, Tolkien and Beowulf are, if you don't study Tolkien when you study Beowulf, you're not really studying Beowulf in some ways. He's also got translations of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl and Sir Orfeo. These are a lot shorter and therefore a lot easier to pick up and read than Beowulf. Beowulf is a long, involved poem. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is much easier to pick up. Pearl and Sir Orfeo are a little more foreign because we're not as familiar with the stories, but they're still worth reading. And you've got stuff as humorous and less serious as The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is kind of a poor title for the book because really a lot of the poems in here are not about Tom Bombadil. There's, let's see, Shadow Bride, there's a poem about a cat. There's a lot of really short poems in here that have nothing to do with Tom Bombadil, but when he was asked to put out more material for Allen and Unwin to publish after the success of The Hobbit, this ended up being one of them, and the Tom Bombadil stuff was just the largest portion of it. So, and then my personal favorite, and this is what really got me interested in poetry, the Lays of Beleriand. This is part of the History of Middle-earth series that Christopher Tolkien published, and it's book 3. It's kind of hard to read that 3, but there it is. The Lays of Beleriand is basically taking the main stories from the Silmarillion and putting them in poetic form. And again, I'll come back to that because that's another really good, there's some really good examples of a particular type of poetry that he wrote. But these books are kind of the main ones that are primarily poetic. Oh, and before I forget, there's also, I've done a video on the Lay of Aotrou and Itroun before, shortly after Christmas 2016 rather. And that's one where he had already published this in a periodical, and it's been republished now for general consumption, basically. But again, another example of a different type of poetry that he wrote. In fact, the 3 poems in there are all slightly different. But that's kind of like an overview of some of his major poetic works. Now I want to kind of get into some of the differences of them, and in the third part of the video I'll get into some of my favorite bits and pieces from these, because some of them are very much well worth reading aloud. So if you watched my video on the Lay of Aotrou and Itroun, one of the things that I kind of noted there was the fact that Tolkien was very painstaking about revising his work. And that's true, of course, of everything he does, but it's particularly true of his poetry, because he's constantly trying to get it right. He wants to get the rhythm right, the meter, the rhyme scheme when he uses a rhyme scheme. And it very much becomes you can tell looking at older versions and comparing them to newer versions, he's constantly trying to get it better and perfect it. And in some cases that means one thing, and in some cases it means another. In the Lays of Beleriand, a lot of the narrative poetry is in rhyming couplets. So, it's kind of what a general lay audience who's not really familiar with poetry would think of when thinking about poetry. So, let me see if I can find a good, obvious example here. This is, let's see. Can't really find a good example off the top of the list here, but I mean, you got the general idea of your first line rhymes with the second line, and then the next 2 lines rhyme with each other, and then the next 2 lines rhyme with each other. It's that sort of poetry. That's what some of the poetry in the Lays of Beleriand is like. Some of it is also not rhyming couplets, but that's what I remember from the Lays of Beleriand is the rhyming couplets, because before I started to really get more appreciative of Tolkien's poetry and the non-rhyming stuff, the rhyming stuff was kind of what appealed to me more. And then you've got The Fall of Arthur, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum, and also Beowulf. These are more along the lines of Old English poetry, which, if you read Christopher Tolkien's commentary on some of his poetic works, basically the way the Old English and Norse style poetry went, and correct me if I'm wrong, I may be misremembering that about the Norse, but at least some of that older poetry didn't have anything to do with rhyming. It had to do with the emphasis on which syllable in the line, basically, that you put. And so the lines are all 8 syllables long, and in each one it gets divided basically into 2 sections of 4 syllables. And there are, the stress will fall on 1 or more of those syllables within the 4 of each set, and then the next one will also have a similar or different pattern, but there's kind of rules that, there's no manual written down anywhere, but if you study the poetry long enough, you realize that there are rules about, if you have a particular pattern in the first 4, I guess first 4 maybe for the viewers, then the second 4 will have to have a particular pattern or fall within a realm of certain particular patterns. They can't just be anywhere, basically. And so you'll get lines that, if you really pay attention to the way the stress on the syllables falls and you hear it in your head, you start to pick up on a little bit of the aesthetic quality of how it reads, and you realize, okay, yeah, I mean, that actually does sound pretty good when you pay attention to how it would sound if read aloud. So, I mean, you've got, the rhyming poetry, you've got the emphasis on rhythm and meter, depending on which type of poetry he's writing. And then, of course, as I mentioned in the video on Aotrou and Itroun, He has some other rhyming poetry that's not just rhyming couplets. It gets more complicated in the rhyming scheme and different things like that. So there's all kinds of different poetry, and I can't get into all of them right now. I mean, there's just too many. But it's definitely well worth exploring, especially if you're just a student of poetry. Tolkien kind of dabbled in a lot of different poetic styles, and so it's really interesting to read because he got pretty good at just about everything he tried. I mean, some he did better than others, of course, but it's really interesting to read because, I mean, he clearly spends a lot of time. And, I mean, the Lays of Beleriand, much like the Lay of Aotrou and Itroun, in the Lays of Beleriand, Christopher Tolkien goes through, older versions and newer versions. So again, you can kind of compare how he's improving the poem over time as he kind of thinks about it, mulls it over, comes up with different words to use so he can change the line to fit a rhyme scheme or a meter better. And it just, if you really want to study poetry, Tolkien has plenty of material to study. So anyway, that's kind of a broad overview of kind of the different types of poetry he wrote. Like I said, can't get into all the different details, but now I want to just pick out a few of my favorite passages from some of these, and just for the pure aesthetic pleasure of it, read them out loud. So let's do that. So from the Lays of Beleriand, the two main poems that get addressed here are the Lay of the Children of Hrin, which of course is about Turin and his sister and all the tragedy that befalls them. That one is in a non-rhyming scheme, and so that one to me, especially when I initially read it, was less interesting. I haven't gone back and read it since I became a little more appreciative of his poetry, but after, reading a few lines, it's still not quite grabbing me the same way. But the one that I really like, the other major poem, is the Lay of Lathian, which is release from bondage is the translation of that term. It's an Elvish word, of course. And there are a couple other small poems that were early abandoned. In fact, that's the title of the section in the book, Poems Early Abandoned. But the Lay of Lathian is basically about Beren and Luthien. And this one is the one that's in rhyming couplets, and it's extremely well written, in my opinion. And so I just kind of want to read the first several lines just to get you an idea of how it goes. And the really early parts is where it really grabs you. In later parts of the poem, you can tell he's kind of working a little harder to find ways to continue keeping it going really well in an aesthetic sense, because he has to kind of work around with words and things. But the early stuff, it really kind of grabs you because of the way it's written. It has that feel of an archaic old story that you sit down to the campfire to listen to and that sort of thing. So let me just read a few lines. A king there was in days of old, ere men yet walked upon the mould. His power was reared in caverns' shade, his hand was over glen and glade. His shields were shining as the moon, his lances keen of steel were hewn. Of silver gray his crown was wrought, the starlight in his banners caught, and silver thrilled his trumpets long, beneath the stars in challenge strong. Enchantment did his realm enfold, where might and glory, wealth untold, he wielded from his ivory throne, in many-pillared halls of stone. And then it goes on, it's basically describing King Thingol's realm, but then there gives another, it gets a little farther down, and it, describes Thingol himself and Luthien. And then there's later a section where it describes Morgoth. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Here we go. The second section of the poem, it mirrors that first beginning. And it says, far in the north, 'neath hills of stone, in caverns black there was a throne. By fires illumined underground, that winds of ice with moaning sound made flare and flicker in dark smoke. The wavering bitter coils did choke. The sunless airs of dungeons deep, where evil things did crouch and creep, there sat a king, no elfin race, nor mortal blood, nor kindly grace, of earth or heaven might he own, far older, stronger than the stone. The world is built of than the fire that burns within, more fierce and dire, and thoughts profound were in his heart, a gloomy power that dwelt apart. And so, of course, now it's starting to describe Morgoth, and it kind of goes in the same type of fashion. But the way it starts out, you get that it doesn't say once upon a time or a long time ago, but it kind of gives you that same feel, and it kind of draws you in a little bit, and I really enjoy that. So that's just a little bit of the Lay of Lathian from the Lays of Beleriand. I kind of want to read a little bit of the Fall of Arthur as well, because the Fall of Arthur this is one that I really wish he had been able to finish, because I'm a huge fan of Arthurian legend and that sort of thing, and he got a fairly decent way in, but it ended, like I say, before the story really starts to get interesting, at least to me. I mean, some people might think he kind of hit some of the highlights, but here's kind of the beginning of the poem as he started to write it. Arthur eastward in arms purposed his war to wage on the wild marches, over seas sailing to Saxon lands, from the Roman realm ruin defending. Thus the tides of time to turn backwards, and the heathen to humble, his hope urged him, that with harrying ships they should hunt no more on the shining shores and shallow waters of South Britain, booty seeking, as when the earth dwindles in autumn days, and soon to its setting the sun is waning, under mournful mist, then a man will lust for work and wandering, while yet warm floweth blood sun-kindled, so burned his soul after long glory for a last essay of pride and prowess to the proof setting, will unyielding in war with fate. And that's kind of the beginning. It's kind of describing Arthur's mood, but you can kind of catch a couple different things there. He's got kind of that old Saxon or Old English version of, you kind of have the way the emphasis falls on the syllables, and there's also a lot of alliteration. So, I mean, you'll get the same consonant sound several times in a given line. You might have noticed that. And he does that a lot in some of his different poems. And so he's got different things going on in this one than in the Lay of Lathian. And it's a different read. It's a very different read. You have to know what you're looking for to really appreciate it. And so it really does help to read the commentary that goes with most of these books, especially the ones that aren't in rhyming couplets, because obviously when you're doing the rhyming scheme, the aesthetic point of the poetry is kind of obvious. But if you're not as familiar, like with the Fall of Arthur, you wouldn't necessarily notice some of it. But if you read the commentary and then you read the poem, you can kind of pick up on the rise and fall, the cadence of the reading, and it helps to not just kind of abstractly read it to yourself, but to even if you don't read it out loud, at least read it in your head as if you were reading out loud, and you can kind of pick up on what's going on. So that's the Fall of Arthur. There's also Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it's another one that's really good. Of course, there's a lot of interesting stuff in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight besides the poetry. There's a lot of imagery. It's a really deep subject matter in a lot of different ways. But let me just read kind of the first lines from it as well. When the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame to firebrands and ashes, the traitor who the contrivance of reason there fashioned was tried for his treachery, the most true upon earth. It was Aeneas the noble and his renowned kindred, who then laid under them lands, and lords became of well nigh all the wealth in the western isles. When royal Romulus to Rome his road had taken, in great pomp and pride he peopled it first, and named it with his own name that yet now it bears. Tyrius went to Tuscany, and towns founded. Langobard in Lombardy uplifted halls, and far over the French flood Felix Brutus on many a broad bank and brave Britain established full fair, where strange things, strife and sadness, at whiles in the land did fare, and each other grief and gladness oft fast have followed there. And there you can see kind of a little mix of the different types of poetry. You've got the first major section from what I just read doesn't really focus on rhyming as much. It focuses much more on the alliteration. But then the last four lines, you get all of a sudden there's some rhyming couplets thrown in. I mean, it's an interesting kind of mix of the two styles, and it again just kind of shows Tolkien dabbles in all these different kinds of poetry. He's interested in all of them and the aesthetics of them. And again, there's commentary in that as well that kind of talks about the style and all that. So those are just some, of course, of Tolkien's poetry. There's a lot more, of course. If you read The Lord of the Rings by itself, there's plenty of poetry there, and if you really pay attention, you can pick up on some of these different themes. Some of the poetry is not rhyming. Some of it is very much of the older non-rhyming style, and if you pay attention, you can kind of pick up on that. But I just kind of wanted to read some of these just to give a feel of the different kinds of poetry that Tolkien wrote and how they sound when read out loud. Because I think really when you're talking about poetry, it really helps to read it out loud. And it helps to read it out loud, especially when you know what you're looking for. So that's going to do it, I think, for this video. Hope you enjoyed the read aloud. So I hope you enjoyed that. There's obviously a lot more poems I could get into, but that could take forever. What are your favorite poems that Tolkien wrote? What are the favorite types of poems that Tolkien worked on? List those in the comments below. I'm curious to get everybody's opinion. Of course, I'm still partial to the rhyming couplets. The Lay of Beleriand, I think, is still my favorite of all the poems that Tolkien wrote, just because it is, partially because it is so well done in its style, but I have kind of learned to appreciate some of the older stuff as well, the more of the alliteration or the metrical and cadence-based poems. I mean, they're all interesting once you really know what you're looking for and you can really pay attention. So, kind of get into that in the comments. If you have a particular favorite, we can get into that. If you also like the video, then please like it, share, and subscribe to the channel, especially if you want to learn more about Tolkien and his other writings. And you can also follow me at Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Bombadil.